Anthony from Recal Travel. I'm excited to be here with you and to share with you all the wonderful stuff that we have planned for today around breathwork training. I am going to do my absolute best to balance a few things here, which is load you up with some really good and valuable information while also making it as interactive as I possibly can. We'll see how I do with that challenge. I am going to get us started. So, I like to start off our webinar with just a positioning, basically, of what is it that we're here for and why. And that can be with this article in Sweat Science, which is a column in Outside Magazine. It's written by a pretty famous author you might know by the name of Alex Hutchinson. He specializes in endurance and in the mountains. And what he says in this article is when you head to altitude, you have to breathe more deeply and more frequently to compensate for that scarcity of oxygen in the thin air. That means these muscles you use to inhale have to work way harder than normal. In fact, those muscles consume 15 to 30% of the oxygen that you inhale when you're at altitude, and they eventually get tired. So, training those muscles should prepare you to handle the extra work of breathing at altitude. And that is what we're here to talk about: breathing and endurance and altitude. So, I have a goal for you during this session, and that is simply put, I want to help you in the little way that I can, hopefully big way, to climb that mountain that you're shooting for or finish that marathon that you have planned in the mountains. Whatever your challenge is, I want to help you get there. So, our agenda for today, pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about what challenges that your respiratory system faces at altitude. We're going to talk about what exactly breathwork training is and what the research literature has to say about it. We're also going to get your own breath assessments, and you'll find out what that means here shortly. And you're going to get a taste of the training as well. And lastly, we're going to end things with where you can go from here. So, just a little bit of administrative stuff. You probably need to know who the heck I am. And so we'll go through that. I'm the founder of a company called Recal, which I've mentioned before. It's short for recalibrate. And it's got its origins in combining mindfulness with adventure travel. And what we found was the type of adventure travel that our clients tended to gravitate toward was something like climbing a mountain or even running a big race in the mountains. And the type of mindfulness that people gravitated toward was breathwork training. And so, what I ended up doing just to get more relevant and more impactful mindfulness methods to our clients was I ended up going down this rabbit hole of breathwork training. First, in something called Wim Hof method, which you all may be familiar with that. It's a combination of breathwork and cold exposure. But then I started to trickle into this world of oxygen advantage, which is breathwork training for more sport and performance purposes. And then I rounded out my breathwork certifications in something called the peak flow. Along the way of doing all of this, I found this little niche world of breathwork training for high altitude preparation. And that is when I basically created the high altitude breathwork training program alongside a few different breathwork practitioners out there. Ended up testing it out on myself, for better or for worse, which we'll talk about in a second. And also with athletes, pro athletes to begin with, mountain guides, certified mountain guides, and then recreational athletes doing their own sort of endeavors in the mountains. Well, I am not somebody that just simply reads things on paper. And looking at the research and how great it sounded about the types of adaptations and benefits that breathwork training has on altitude endurance. I don't just like reading it on paper. I ended up wanting to test a lot of this stuff on myself. And that began with something called the nasal marathon, where I basically only trained using breathwork training for a marathon, which, by the way, at that time I had never run more than 5 or 6 miles maybe at a time in my life, using that wonderful breathwork training to train for the marathon. I then ran the marathon with my mouth taped shut, so I only breathed through my nose for the duration of the marathon. I can proudly say that I did survive. I also learned a lot about the adaptations you can make in your body related to endurance using breathwork training. Then, from beyond that marathon, we then took the challenge to the next level and elevation in something called the Sea Level to 14er challenge, which is where I trained at sea level using breathwork training, and then arrived in Colorado and trekked a 14er. I also, along the way, of course, learned a lot there about the type of adaptations you can make at sea level, and in your case, Kristen, at in San Francisco, and how that can actually relate to the mountain itself. Now we've gone on from that 14,000 foot level, and we've trained clients that have gone, are headed actually to Everest this coming year. So it's really the entire top to bottom, bottom to top, I should say, level of testing that we've done. And along the way, that's when we've now created our high altitude breathwork training program. So let's put a pause on my talking and let's do a breath assessment for you right now. This breath assessment that you are going to do is something called the carbon dioxide tolerance test. Now, the way that this works is from a seated position. So if you're standing or if you're walking on one of those treadmills, maybe underneath your desk, something like that, if you can go ahead and take a seat, what we're going to do is sit up nice and straight. You're going to take a normal inhale through your nose, a normal exhale. And then after that normal and passive exhale, you're going to take a really deep breath. You're going to try to fill up your lungs as much as you can. And then when you reach the top of that inhale, we'll then begin a very slow exhale through your nose, as slow as you can possibly make it, getting to the point that you're extending that exhale as long as you can, all the way until you're squeezing every last bit of air out of your lungs. This is like a very slow trickle of air out of your nose. I'm going to start a timer. And what we're going to do is try to see how long you can extend your exhale for. And that score, that time on the timer that is shown when you're done with that exhale is effectively your carbon dioxide tolerance test. Okay? So go ahead and sit up nice and straight. Relax your shoulders to your side. Take a normal breath in with me here. Take a normal inhale through your nose, a normal exhale. And now begin that deep inhale. Fill up your lungs as much as you can. Sniff in even just a bit more air. And now begin that slow exhale, ideally through your nose here. It's so slow that you can barely tell the air is trickling out of your nose, but don't at any point stop the exhale. This is one continuous exhale. You extend this exhale as long as you possibly can. Get to the point that you're squeezing every last bit of air out of your lungs. Maybe you're even slightly curling over, squeezing into the diaphragm and the abs. I'm going to let the timer run for about 10 more seconds. Right. Great job. If you're still going, huge thumbs up to you. I'm going to go ahead and move along. That is the carbon dioxide tolerance test. Hopefully, you noticed the time that was on the screen when you actually had to take that fresh breath at the very end of that exhale, ideally. But you might be wondering now, okay, Anthony, how good was my CO2 TT? Or even what are the other assessments? You mentioned this is one of two that we're going to do today. There's actually five in total that we coach as part of our training programs. And ultimately, how can I actually improve on these breath assessment scores? Well, my answer to you, for better or for worse, is stick around and find out. Because we're going to move right along into some of the challenges that you actually face when you're at altitude. And I want to make a note that number one, I'm focused just on the respiratory system here. We're here talking about breath work. I'm focused on the respiratory system. But number two, I want to make the disclaimer I am not a medical doctor. Anytime that you're taking on some endurance challenge in the mountains or taking on the altitude, always consult your doctor before you do so. And that is obviously always best. And I am not necessarily your medical doctor. So please do consult your doctor before taking on an altitude challenge. So, what happens at altitude as it relates to your respiratory system? We're going to focus on three things. The first of which is you may experience an increase in ventilation, as we say, or your respiratory rate, or simply put, the number of breaths that you take per minute. What's happening behind the scenes here is that as you go up in elevation, the air pressure starts to decrease. Go up in elevation, air pressure decreases. Now, there's a partial pressure of oxygen in that air at any elevation. And of course, that partial pressure is going to decrease as well as you go up in elevation. So, for example, I'm sorry, I'm going to use your example of San Francisco again, Kristen. At sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen there is about 160 millimeters of mercury. Now, if you climb a 14er, you're already dropping from 160 millimeters of mercury, which is a measurement for pressure, going from 160 to 95. That's like 60% already, just going to 14,000 feet, which is not just, that's still a significant amount of altitude. But say if you are one of those people gunning for Everest this spring, you're going to reach only 50, this is off the top of my head, 55 or 60 millimeters of mercury. I know that that's about 33% of the amount of available oxygen to you that's at sea level. So, as a result of that decrease in the amount of available oxygen in the air that's around you, your body starts to respond by breathing faster. And I'm here as your breathwork coach to tell you that breathing faster is not always better. And we'll get into why and how that's the case here shortly. Let's look at the second thing that happens when you're at altitude, and that is that over time, known as acclimatization, you'll experience an increase, hopefully, in your hemoglobin concentration, or your body will basically be creating new RBCs, which is red blood cells. Now, this takes time, and that time is known as acclimatization. And so that is a challenge that your body faces. That puts stress on your body, acclimatization time. Well, altitude in general puts some stress on your body. We can talk about how to combat that with breathwork training. But acclimatization produces, hopefully, new red blood cells. This is something that happens at altitude. Now, the third thing that we're going to talk about that happens at altitude is that as a result of the lesser oxygen availability at altitude, you then can experience a decrease in your oxygen saturation, basically the saturation level or density, I guess you could say, of oxygen in your blood. Now, as a result of that lower oxygen saturation in your blood, that's going to result in a lower aerobic power, which is also known as VO2 max. If you're familiar with that physiological test called VO2 max, it basically means your body's maximal capacity for uptake of oxygen in your body. And what happens at altitude is with that lower oxygen saturation, that VO2 max, your total body oxygen uptake capacity becomes lower. So these are three key challenges that you face at altitude as it relates to your respiratory system. So you might be thinking, okay, great. Thanks for the list of challenges. I might already know a lot of those ones. How in the world does breathwork training, what does breathwork training have to do with all of this? So let's make that connection now. In order to make the connection, I'm going to come right back to where we were, which was outlining these three challenges: an increase in ventilation, you breathe more per minute; an increase in hemoglobin, but that takes time through acclimatization; and a decrease in your oxygen saturation levels of your blood. The way that we coach breathwork training here at Recal is using three different sides. There's three sides that we look at it when we think of breathwork training. The first side is your mechanical efficiency. So, how are you breathing? Is it with your nose? Is it with your mouth? Where and how is the air getting sent? Are you using a diaphragm? Are you filling up your entire lungs? How quick or slow are you breathing? That's all what we look at with mechanical efficiency. And that is related to how we can combat that challenge of increased ventilation. The second side of breathwork training is making high altitude adaptation. It's a niche side of breathwork training, but something that you can do at sea level, which has been highly tested as well as on myself and through the research literature, and making specific adaptations in your body that can help you at altitude. And the third side of breathwork training is what's called respiratory muscle training. So specifically targeting the muscles that you use to breathe and train and condition those in preparation for the challenges that it's going to face due to, for example, the decrease in oxygen saturation. So these are the three sides of breathwork training. Let's dive in a bit more into that first side, which is mechanical efficiency and how it relates to that challenge that you face, which is breathing more times per minute. In general, breathwork can help fix bad habits and improve the efficiency with which you breathe. And when I say efficient breathing, if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this webinar, is this right here, this equation. I want you to think about breathing with the three-part formula of NSL. Breathe through your nose, breathe slow, and breathe low. And when I say low, I mean that we are engaging the diaphragm and the belly region here. NSL, nose, slow, and low. This is the most optimal and efficient way of breathing. What you can do by changing your mechanical efficiency, getting rid of old bad habits, making place for new ones, is breathe nose, slow, and low. This is going to help you eliminate the impact of dead space, or basically the space between your nose, down your trachea, and in the top of the lungs. Basically, that's unused air. With each and every breath, you can eliminate the impact of that dead space. You can also increase and then use the increased lung capacity. We can properly engage your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles with mechanical efficient breathing. And lastly, you can eliminate over breathing. And it might sound as simple as breathing more times per minute means I'm oxygenating my body more. And I'm here to tell you that absolutely that is not the case. Ironically, breathing more slowly gives your lungs a chance to fully recycle the air with each and every breath. But on top of that, if we overbreathe, we're getting rid of CO2 more quickly. And CO2 in the blood actually helps oxygenate your body. It's basically something called the Bohr effect, and basically maintaining some level of CO2 and not just offloading it all the time allows the oxygen molecules that are being carried around in your body by the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. It allows that oxygen to hop off of the hemoglobin and out of your blood and into, say, the muscle tissue or the tissues that make up your organs. This is vitally important to get the oxygen out of the blood and onto the muscle tissues that are requiring it to simply contract. Um, so eliminating overbreathing is what you can do with mechanically efficient breathing. Now, let's take a quick look at the literature on this, looking at a study on mechanical efficiency. A study was done on basically slow, deep breathing. The way that this study was positioned was people that live at sea level, which they call lowlanders. There's nothing low about you sea level dwellers. I promise. Um, they had their SpO2, which is a fancy way of saying oxygen saturation, assessed after 15 minutes at the elevations of 4,600 meters and 5,400 meters. So pretty significant altitudes. This is like 15,000 feet and above type of levels if you're on the feet, the standard metric. I don't know, remember what that's called. Anyway, not important. What the conclusion of this study was that their oxygen saturation levels, just by changing the way that they breathed, increased by 7.6% to 9.3%. A typical healthy human fluctuates between 95% and 100% in their oxygen saturation at, say, sea level. Um, when at altitude, that drops. To then combat that drop in oxygen saturation by 7.6 to 9.3% is super significant just by changing the way that you breathe. So let's zoom out, and we're now going to zoom into the high altitude adaptation side of breathwork training. There's a special type of breathwork training exercise called intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. That basically means going back and forth between hypoxic, which means low oxygen, hypercapnic, hyper meaning high, capnic meaning carbon dioxide. So high carbon dioxide training, back and forth between low oxygen and high CO2 training. This, generally speaking, is also known as high altitude simulation exercises. What this type of training has been shown to do is actually increase your hemoglobin concentration, or in other words, create new red blood cells, and subsequently impact and improve your VO2 max, that aerobic power, which we were talking about earlier. What this type of exercise also does is it can increase your carbon dioxide tolerance. In other words, with a good CO2 tolerance, you don't feel like you need to exhale all the time, or at least as many times as you would otherwise. This is going to help you feel less out of breath when you're at altitude. And if you feel less out of breath and you can then breathe more slowly and breathe less times per minute, which is what we talked about in mechanical efficiency side, of course, then you can maintain mechanical efficiency more with an increased CO2 tolerance. You can also, in general, decrease what's called the RPE, the rate of perceived exertion, which has been directly tied to endurance. So if you feel like you're not exerting as much energy because you're breathing less and you're not feeling out of breath, your body actually responds by giving you more endurance. And lastly, having a higher CO2 tolerance means you're not going to need to exhale off that CO2 as often. And that again is going to prevent that overbreathing, which we talked about earlier, which effectively, if you're overbreathing, you're not actually oxygenating your body as much as you would think. So this in general is what we refer to when we say high altitude adaptation style or side of breathwork training. Let's look quickly at some of the literature on this particular style of breathwork training. This exercise, IHHT, intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training, was tested sea level on test subjects. They basically did this type of training for 30 to 45 minutes, 3 times a week over the course of 8 weeks. As a result of this training, they experienced an increase in their hemoglobin concentration by 5.35%, and that resulted in an increase of nearly 11% on their VO2 max. These numbers are really astonishing. Just by simulating high altitude environment, your body can make adaptations, including an increase in hemoglobin concentration and then the subsequent increase in VO2 max. So that is the high altitude side of the equation. I'm throwing a lot of information at you. We're going to now take a little pause here. And I am going to give you the opportunity to do a second breath assessment with me now. And again, there's 5 in total that we coach. I'm going to cover 2 of them here on this call. This second breath assessment is something called location of movement, or LOM. The way that this works is I want you to put one hand up on your chest and one on your lower belly. And from this position, I want you to, I'm just admitting another person here. Hey, Ujwal, we are in the second breath assessment that we're doing here, a location of movement. So if you could, if you want to join us, sit up nice and straight, put one hand on your chest, one hand on your lower belly, and look down with your eyes, look down the front of your body. And I want you just to breathe normally. Just take a moment so that you can see my eyes. I'm going to turn my hat backwards. Just breathe normally on your own. Focus on where you're noticing the movement in your body when you breathe. Take just maybe two more breaths here. Normal breaths, completely unconscious, normal breathing. So hopefully you have an idea now on where you actually feel the movement when you breathe. When we do a location of movement assessment, we typically look at three different zones that you may be breathing in. Zone one, starting from the bottom, zone one, zone two, and zone three. Can you notice or can you remember when you were breathing just now if your breathing was in zone one, zone two, or zone three? And I want you to answer this question, maybe throw it into the chat before I move on to give you the answer of which zone is best. Which zone do you think is best? I may have already hinted at the answer earlier in that mechanical efficiency slide. So, we may have already gotten there, but if you want to share what you think, which zone is best, zone two, zone three is best. Okay, Ujwal, nice. You were not here for the mechanical efficiency slide. I appreciate the suggestion there. So I feel zone two. So some of zone two is okay, Ujwal. That is fine. Zone three, however, in that upper chest area, that is not where most of your gas diffusion, which means oxygen getting into the bloodstream, that is not where that happens. The bottom branches of your bronchi, you have 23 major branches of your bronchi. The bottom branches, 17 through 23, the lowest ones, are actually where over 70% of your breathing or of the oxygen diffusion in the bloodstream actually happens. And so, cool. No worries. So you really meant zone one there. And if you meant zone one, then you are absolutely correct. Zone one is where we want the majority of the movement happening when we breathe. Some zone two is okay, that middle rib cage area, but we want to avoid zone three, upper chest, even into the shoulder area movement, right? Okay. So done with that assessment. Let's go back to where we were before, which is covering these three sides of the breathwork training. And let's focus in on this third side of breathwork training, which is respiratory muscle training. As I mentioned before, at altitude, you may experience a decrease in the oxygen saturation of your blood. Let's talk about how respiratory muscle training might be able to combat that. And when I say respiratory muscle training, the muscles that I'm referring to are primarily the diaphragm muscle, which is a dome-shaped muscle just beneath your lungs. It kind of seals off the edges of your rib cage, and then your intercostal muscles, which are each muscle in between each rib bone in your rib cage. Your costals are, well, I know they call them rib bones, but they're primarily cartilage. And your costals are those, and the intercostal means the muscles in between each rib bone in your rib cage. So with respiratory muscle training, you can actually maintain a higher blood oxygen saturation, because by strengthening these muscles, you can actually be able to pull in and out, but primarily in at altitude, more sufficient levels of oxygen. Remember, the air is thinner when you're at altitude. That means that it takes more effort for you to pull in the air from that lower pressure volume of space into your lungs, because gas moves from a high pressure space to a low pressure space. If the low pressure space is outside your lungs at altitude, it's not going to move as easily into your lungs. So it takes more effort to get the air in. Secondly, you can reduce respiratory muscle fatigue, which we talked about early on with that first article that I showed. Those muscles do oftentimes fatigue much more quickly at altitude. You can also increase your ability to adapt to that acclimatization time on the mountain. You can ultimately also improve the breathing economy, basically how much exertion that you have to put forth for something like breathing. And that again is going to decrease that rate of perceived exertion, which is tied directly to endurance. Now, just a quick note, we do want to focus on both inspiratory, that means your inhalation, inspiratory muscles, as well as expiratory or exhalation muscles. Let's quickly look at the literature and some research on this specific topic around respiratory muscle training. This was a study done specifically on inspiratory muscle training and how that actually related to somebody's blood oxygen saturation while at altitude. And what this study looked at was these test subjects, 2 times per day for 4 weeks, did inspiratory muscle training, basically 50% air resistance to the air that they breathed in. They used a device called Power Breathe, but hey, you block one nostril, you can also resist 50% of the air that comes in. And then they tested their oxygen saturation at various elevations in the Himalayas specifically. Number one, what they found was as a result of doing inspiratory muscle training, they did increase their strength of their inhales. So that paid off. They increased by about 15%. But what they found was, and there's a big gap between 1,400 meters and 4,880 meters, but they found that there was no change when they tested their oxygen saturation levels below 4,880 meters. But above 4,880 meters, that seemed to be a threshold for this specific study where they saw an increase in, on average, 6% in somebody's oxygen saturation levels, as much as 10%. And this is not even by changing the way that they breathed. This is completely passive, normal breathing, rest, as a result of strengthening your respiratory muscles. So that's quite significant, right? You put that with proper breathing, well, then you've really got something great that's going to combat that oxygen saturation somebody faces at altitude. So let's talk about how we bring it out of the lab, out of the research studies, out of these little like tertiary places in the world around respiratory muscle training. How do we bring that out of the lab and into the real world? Because that's what this is all about. We want to have better endurance. We want to enjoy our treks at altitude more. And that is where we created our high altitude breathwork training program, which is a 5 week training program built to increase your altitude endurance. Now, over time, we've been lucky and blessed to be able to have many people at this point do this training with, quite frankly, incredible results across the board. We've had people climb some of the highest mountains in the world, Aconcagua, Cotopaxi, many of the 14ers. We've got people right now training for Denali and Everest. And so people have done some great mountains with this. We've also had some clients run incredible races like the Leadville 100 or the Bear 100, some of the more challenging endurance events that have an altitude element to it. We've also been lucky enough to have been featured in the media a few times at this point. Some journalists themselves have actually taken it upon themselves to do the training and then go and do something in the altitude. And we've been able to also strike incredible partnerships out there in the world. Just a couple of weeks ago, we I was a co-host on a webinar with Climbing the Seven Summits, which was really exciting. We have partnerships with expedition tour operators out there in the world beyond Climbing the Seven Summits, one known as Grajales, which runs trips at Aconcagua. So we've had, yeah, just our fair share of opportunities in the media. Now, let's have you experience more of the training. I'm going to coach you through an exercise that's specifically designed to increase your CO2 tolerance. Now, if you remember what we talked about, with an increase in CO2 tolerance, that means that you're going to feel less out of breath when you're training, when you're exercising. This can be at sea level, by the way, and all the way up to the top of Everest. With a better CO2 tolerance, you'll feel less out of breath. Therefore, you can maintain more mechanically efficient breathing, and you'll prevent overbreathing, which I talked about actually does not oxygenate your body. It does the opposite if you're overbreathing. This exercise that we're going to do is called Breathe Light. And literally, as the title suggests, we are going to breathe lighter than we normally would. So, in order to do that, I invite you to take your pointer finger, put it right beneath your nose, just resting on your upper lip. Do your best to also relax this shoulder. We don't want much tension there. But with your finger just beneath your nose, take a couple of normal breaths in and out through your nose. I want you to feel the air as it runs across your finger on the way in and back out, across your finger on the way out. Now that you have an idea of what that air feels like going across your finger, I want you to start to breathe lighter, breathe slower than you normally would, so much so that you can barely feel the air run across your finger. What we're going to start to do is invite this feeling of air hunger. Air hunger is that feeling that you want to take a much bigger breath. What air hunger is basically doing behind the scenes is it's causing an increase, or it's a result of an increase in carbon dioxide in your blood. You're not allowing your body right now to take a full exhale. That means that CO2 levels are rising in the blood. Try to maintain that very light breathing for the next 45 seconds or so, even if this is uncomfortable. Breathwork training in general is challenging. This is one of those subtly maybe challenging exercises. It's going to also help build some mental resilience, which is what you're going to need at altitude as well. If at any point your breathing becomes really erratic, like you can't control it, take a couple of normal breaths, come back to this light breathing. Try to still control your breath, especially at the top of an inhale and at the bottom of the exhale. We're here for another 10 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. You can drop your finger now. Come back to some normal breathing. You did great. We're done with that. So that is an exercise called Breathe Light. The way that we typically coach that up in our training programs is roughly 3 to 5 minutes of that, either per day or at least on each day that we do high altitude simulation training, which is 3 times per week, by the way. Um, that is a key part of our training program. So let's talk about, and not necessarily, by the way, if you have any questions on these exercises, throw them up into the chat. I'll try to reserve space at the end of our webinar to go through these questions. Let's talk about, but not necessarily get coached through, just for the sake of time, some other exercises. So when it comes to respiratory muscle training, especially the inspiratory inhalation side of the equation of respiratory muscle training, we have an exercise called hook lying diaphragmatic breathing. A hook lying position is basically you flat on your back in a supine position, but your feet are flat on the ground and your knees are forming a 90-degree angle. In this position, you basically take a strong inhale through your nose and try to feel that diaphragm do some work here. The diaphragm, again, that dome-shaped muscle beneath your lungs at the bottom of your rib cage. When you inhale, you maybe can feel the belly rise, the belly, right? The lower rib cage, abdomen area rise. And then you just allow a passive exhalation. It's all focused here on a strong inhalation, make that diaphragm work, and then a passive exhalation. Now, you can make this more challenging by blocking one nostril or even adding weight or a resistance band around your lower rib cage area to provide resistance for your diaphragm to work against, because it'll then become stronger with that resistance. So those are two ways that you can make it more challenging. But this is hook lying diaphragmatic breathing. Now, on the expiratory side of the equation, we can look at an exercise called balloon breathing. And by the way, I want to acknowledge, Ujwal, I've seen your question. I will address that in our Q&A section. Thank you for that. On the expiratory side of the equation of respiratory muscle training, let's look at something called balloon breathing. And yes, I think children sometimes are the best at doing expiratory muscle training. Just kidding. The way that this works is you basically take full exhales, as full as you can, out into a balloon because the balloon is providing resistance to the air when you actually exhale. So, say, for example, if you start your timer for 1 minute, you basically try to blow up that balloon as many times as you can in 1 minute. Focus, though, on taking full exhales, really squeezing the abdomen with each and every exhale. A way that you can do this that provides more of a challenge is you can do this in a 90-90 position, which is your feet, hopefully not with shoes on like the photo shows, up against a wall, and throw maybe something in between your knees. You don't need that though, and you're blowing into a balloon that way. The last example exercise that I'm going to talk through with you is that high altitude simulation, also known as that intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training that we've talked about. Again, intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training means going back and forth between a low oxygen hypoxic, high carbon dioxide hypercapnic environment for your body. A lot of information being thrown at you, but basically the way that this works is from a standing up position, you take a normal inhale and a normal exhale. At the bottom of that passive and normal exhale, you pinch your nose and hold your breath, and you begin walking. And as the feeling of air hunger builds and becomes maybe a medium level of air hunger, medium to strong, instead of stopping there, you can see why this is challenging. You begin a jog. So you go from a walk to a jog, and you go and jog as long as you can on that one breath. And when you get done and you can't go any further, you stop. But instead of allowing your body to take a normal or full breath, what you do there is take 6 minimal breaths in and out through your nose, kind of like you're just shuttling air in and out through the nose. And then after those 6 minimal breaths, you can begin normal breathing for the next 12 to 18 breaths. You can repeat this a few times as you want. This is the walk to jog variation of high altitude simulation, also known as intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. Yes, this is very challenging. No one ever said that breathwork training would be easy, but the benefits are real, they're true, and they can, if you train harder with breathwork training now, you can make your experience on the mountain or your endurance or whatever it is that you're trying to do at altitude more enjoyable, or you can more likely accomplish that. Our success rates are actually significantly higher for people that have done breathwork training than those that haven't on things like summit of Aconcagua, for example. So, what about on the mountain itself? So, we talked a lot about training when you're actually at home. What about on the mountain itself? So, we do coach some on mountain protocols. Um, Something like flat out, how should you breathe, period, when you're at altitude? Or what's the best protocol that you have for recovering, especially in between acclimatization hikes when you're in that acclimatization process? Or what if I start to feel the feelings of acute mountain sickness, AMS? What is a breathing protocol that can work to combat those symptoms? Just a full disclosure, anytime you feel symptoms of altitude sickness, do not stay quiet on that. Always share that with your guide, with your expedition team, with your climbing partners. Um, Truly, do not hide those symptoms. Always address them. This breathwork protocol is just simply for combating the lighter symptoms of acute mountain sickness. All right, we're going to wrap up with where can you go from here? Then we're going to jump into some Q&A. But where can you go from here? And I'm sorry to hear that, Ujwal, that you got AMS in Nepal at 5,500 meters. I mean, that's a significant elevation. So I certainly understand that. Um, and from my personal experience, and as well as the experience of many that we've coached, I would say key in on what I'm about to share with you about the types of trainings that you can do from here, because this is potentially going to give you more tools to combat that AMS. There is no guarantee in any way that anyone can prevent AMS, but doing something like breathwork training can help give you more tools in the toolbox to help combat the effects of altitude. So there are three ways to train here with Recal's training programs. And I'm going to show you a few prices on here. Just know that I'm just want to outline for you clearly and transparently the training options that we have. So the first training that we have is maybe the most robust as well, and that is a personal training package. You get me one-on-one if you have an expedition coming up, and I will actually work with you to get your assessments and then put together a customized and tailored training plan for you, depending on what your expedition is coming up. Expedition, your marathon, even if you're just running a marathon at sea level, breathwork training can make an impact, and we can set up a program for you. The second way to train, and this is actually our most popular version of training, is the online video course. So each and every week out of 5 weeks, you have videos, demonstrations, and a week by week plan laid out in front of you online. And the last way that you can train is the most accessible, at least monetarily as well. And it's self-guided training plan. It's basically training workbook. That workbook, by the way, is included in these other versions of the training. But what you get out of that self-guided training is the workbook, and you can follow along over the course of your 5 weeks. This includes written descriptions of each and every exercise and a way to follow through the training. Now, I am excited to say also, as um, as of this week, we are launching our Training Peaks plans. So if you do in fact use the app, the software program Training Peaks, we are launching our training programs on that as well. Now, I have a special offer though for those of you watching here on the webinar, and of course, if you're catching this recording, I'm super thrilled to offer you some special deals here. The first one is the group training plan special. So every now and then, and we're starting to pick up on these, given a lot of people are coming into the summer with their endeavors in the mountains. If you were to buy the online training program for 275, you can get added to a group training, which basically includes 3 different calls with me. But you must register by Monday of next week so that we can slot you into one of our upcoming groups. So basically, for the price of the online training, you get some one-on-one or one to a group, really is what it is, type of value. The QR code in the top right of this slide, by the way, will send you to a web page, super straightforward, on how you can actually cash in on these offers. Right, this is a custom landing page for the webinar. Number two, I'm offering to you the free chance to join one of our 45-minute live breathwork training sessions. Normally, these are $30 as a drop-in, or we have monthly members, and that costs $85 a month. But for you, someone who's watched this webinar, you can have a free drop-in for the next live training session. These are held every single Monday morning at 7:30 a.m. Mountain Time. But of course, you can catch the recording as well if that time doesn't work for you. The last thing here is um, a free consultation with me just to discover whether or not your breathing is quote unquote expedition ready. Again, this QR code that's shown on the screen, if you go to that web page, it's basically just recaltravel.com/webinar. You can go ahead and submit your inquiry or sign up for any of the offers. Again, that's that group training special. Basically, buy an online training program and get some value close to personal training. Number two is that free drop in to one of our 45-minute live streamed breathwork training sessions coached by yours truly. And lastly, a free consultation with me as well. If you want to, you can follow us on any of the Instagram, Facebook channels, etc. Recal. Oh, I got to change that. Recal Training is our new handle. Yes, I did just change that. Or me, Anthony Lorubbio. We are in the midst of a 100 Days to Everest content campaign for all of the folks that have Himalaya expeditions coming up, but really it's just good breathwork training content. And of course, you can always shoot me an email as well. I will leave you with this one last thought, and then we'll jump into Q&A. And that is a quote from the great Lisa Thompson. She's the second ever USA woman to climb the mountain K2. That's the second highest mountain in the world. And what she says about our breathwork training program is, quote, as both a high altitude climber and a coach who prepares others for mountain adventures, I can't overstate the value of Recal's breathwork training program. I've seen firsthand how this program helps my athletes acclimatize more effectively, recover faster, and perform their best. Recal's a game changer for anyone looking to optimize their experience in the mountains, whether they're tackling their first high altitude trek or they're aiming for a more technical summit. I am super humbled by Lisa's words. She's been an incredible influence and inspiration to all of us at Recal and what she does. And I'm just very thankful for what she has to say about our breathwork training. With that, I will open it up to Q&A. You can, I'll first actually address one of the questions here in our chat, which is, quote, I have a severely deviated septum. How does this affect high altitude breathing? Um, so number one, with a deviated septum, there's of course not a surefire 100% solution to literally a physical setback or challenge like this. But there's a few things that you can do with breathwork training to help. The first one is understand, yes, you have a deviated septum. However, we still want to use the nose because the nose is a very adaptable, is it an organ, I guess you could call it? structure of organs, right? And if you can nose breathe as much as possible during every day, but especially at night, which is a really valuable period of time for you to train your nose to overcome this challenge that you have with a deviated septum, do something like taping your mouth shut at night just to ensure that you're breathing through your nose. Mouth tape is something that I do oftentimes recommend people, every person, but also those with deviated septums, to just train that nose to make the adaptations. Number two, with a deviated septum, you don't want to also add in something like having congestion into the equation as well. And there's a really special breathwork training protocol that we call the nose unblocking exercise. So I would recommend you doing that before exercise, before training, when you wake up in the morning. If you're actually climbing every morning that you wake up in your tent, do the nose unblocking exercise. It basically works something like this. You take a normal inhale through your nose and a normal exhale. At the bottom of that exhale, pinch your nose and hold your breath. This might sound familiar to you. But rock back and forth, or even shake out your head. Doing this rocky motion with a breath hold, go for about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, somewhere to reach a level of medium air hunger. When you're done, release your nose, breathe in through your nose immediately after. What this is going to do is it's going to bring in some nasal nitric oxide into the system, right? So it's actually going to help clear up your passageway into the lungs. Nitric oxide helps with gas diffusion, by the way, and it's also a vasodilator, so it opens up the blood vessels. It's this breath hold's also going to uptick CO2, which also dilates the blood vessels. But really, what you'll start to feel is the nose opening up. That congestion, more moisture will be created in your nose, and you'll actually feel like you opened up that nasal airway. So that's a suggestion that I have for you, a very specific protocol. In general, though, we want you to use your nose honestly as much as possible, even with that deviated septum. If you convert to mouth breathing, the nose as an airway just starts to shut down, right? And we really don't want that. We want you as best as possible to breathe with your nose, breathe slow, and breathe low into that zone one area with each and every breath that you take. Are there any other questions that we have? You can either throw those up in the chat or feel free at this point to unmute yourself and you can ask me verbally as well. Going once, going twice. All right. In case you're wondering, by the way, the training plans in terms of time commitment, we recommend people doing it 6 times a week for 15 to 20 minutes each day. So you're looking at 15 to 20 minutes each day for 6 days out of the week. Sometimes people bundle that though and do both the respiratory muscle training and high altitude adaptation side of things at once. And that results in about 30 to 40 minutes of training. And you can do that just 3 times a week. Just so you have an idea of the type of training time commitment. So I will go ahead and close. I want to thank you all so much for joining. As I said from the very beginning, my biggest goal here is to help enable you to accomplish what you want to in the mountains. And I hope that through breathwork training, we can help you get there. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day. Yeah.